Hey guys, this is Hemant from Edureka. Welcome to this live session on Azure. Today in this session, we're going to see how you can secure your applications using virtual networks. Alright, now before we go ahead with the session, I want to know how many of you are acquainted with the idea of Azure? How many of you know what Azure actually is? Right, and I'd also like to add, guys, any doubts that you have during the session, please put it in your comment box, and I have my team with me here. They'll be happy to answer your questions. All right, so with that, okay, so I'll assume you guys know what Azure is. So basically, for those who don't know, Azure is basically a cloud computing platform using which you launch services, using which you launch servers on Azure, right? Now, using Azure, what we're going to do today is we are going to launch two servers, a web server and a database server. And using that, we are going to configure the properties, the security properties of it using virtual networks, right? So let's go ahead and see what all we are going to learn in this today's session. So today in this session, first we'll start off with what is a virtual machine, right? We're going to understand what is a virtual machine, how we can configure it, how we can launch it in Azure. Once we have done that, we'll move on to virtual network. So before understanding what is a virtual network, we'll first understand why do we actually need a virtual network, right? Once that is done, we'll move on and see what is a virtual network exactly and its components, right? And towards the end, we'll be doing a demo wherein, like I said, we'll be deploying two servers, which we'll be configuring from scratch, that is a web server and a database server, right? And we'll be deploying them in virtual networks and configuring their properties, right? So guys, I hope this agenda is clear to you. Let's move ahead and start off with the first session, which is what is a virtual machine. So what is a virtual machine? So a virtual machine is basically a raw server that you get from your cloud provider. That raw server could be an Ubuntu machine, it could be a Windows machine, right? So it's basically just like your own personal computer. Rather than purchasing it, you're renting it out on cloud, right? When you're renting it out on cloud, now it is the same as if it was on your own computer, right? So it's a fresh piece of operating system. You can install as many softwares as you want. You can want it to be, make it to be a web server. You can make it to be a worker tier environment. You can configure it to be anything, right? So today we are going to make it a web server and a database server. Moving on, guys, so this is what virtual machine is all about. And also, if you compare it with AWS, which is also a popular cloud computing service, with in AWS, this same service is called EC2. All right. In Azure, it's called virtual machine. In AWS, it is called EC2. All right, moving ahead, guys. Now let's start with virtual networks and first understand why do we actually need virtual networks. All right, so like I said, we have virtual machines, right? So if you say launch two virtual machines and you want both of them to communicate with each other. For example, in our session today, in our demo session, what we'll be doing is that we'll be deploying a web server and we'll be deploying a database server, and we want the web server to talk to the database server, right? For this communication, we need a channel and hence we need a network, right? But why virtual networks? So if you guys would have noticed, in cloud there are no wires, there are no switches, there are no routers. All right, so your virtual machine is connected using a logical connection, right? It is logic. These two servers are logically isolated, and that is why we call it virtual, right? So this is so we understood that for the communication scale sake we need a virtual network. Let's now understand what a virtual network exactly is, right? So a virtual network is just like a representation of your network but on the cloud, right? So for example, we launched a server on the cloud and we connect to a virtual network, right? When we connect to our virtual network that is on Azure, our network will include that server as if it's on our own network, that is on premise, right? That is what a virtual network is. That is how powerful a virtual network is, right? Your server will be on the cloud, but your company or your company's network will feel as if the server is on your own network, right? And it's, like I said, it's a logical isolation of the Azure cloud dedicated to your subscription. That is, whatever resources that you have launched in the cloud, it logically isolates it from the rest of the resources that are there on Azure that maybe it could be your resources or someone else's resources as well. It logically isolates them and they are insulated to other resources. It doesn't matter if the other resources are failing or doing anything, right? They are all isolated. So this is what a virtual network is all about. Now, when we say virtual network, it basically has a lot of components. Let's understand these components. So the first component is an Azure subnet. Now, what is an Azure subnet? Basically, when you divide a network into subparts, it is called an Azure subnet. All right. So when you divide your virtual network into parts, it's called a subnet. Now, this subnet can actually be given unique properties. For example, in this same virtual network, you have 3 virtual machines, right? One virtual machine is in one subnet, and the other virtual machine is another subnet. But this subnet you can configure to be unique. For example, we want to create a public subnet. So a public subnet is basically a subnet which has internet access. All right. So we can configure the properties in a way that this particular net, the machines in this particular subnet will have the internet access, and the other particular subnet will not have the internet access. So a subnet which doesn't have the internet access is called a private subnet. All right. So the virtual machine in this particular subnet will not have internet access. But when you actually see it from a broader perspective, all of these servers are on the same network, right? But because of the subnets, because of the properties of subnets, they reflect different properties, right? So being on the same network, they have different properties, and using subnets, this is how subnets are actually useful. Right. So this is what this is all you need to know about subnets, guys. Now with subnets, the properties that I was talking about, say I want to connect to a web server, right? So for connecting to the web server, for accessing that website, I need to go through HTTP protocol, right? So all of this is configured in a firewall. Now what is that firewall called? That firewall is actually network security groups. Now what are network security groups? Like I said, they are just firewalls in which you put in the properties that you want the subnet to reflect. For example, I want to connect to my web server, so I have to allow all HTTP traffic on that subnet, and for that I'll have to attach that particular network security group to that subnet. Now, I know it's a lot to take. I just explained you 3 components, and you might be thinking which component goes where, right? And so I have this diagram. So I'll just summarize what I just explained it to you. So we have this virtual network. In the virtual network, we have subnets, and a subnet is attached to a network security group. Right, so this network security group is where you will be configuring all the protocols, all the properties that you want your particular machine to reflect. This firewall will be attached to the subnet in which you will be deploying your virtual machine. All right, so this is a place where you will be deploying your virtual machine, and it will be attached to the subnet. Your network security group, and this subnet is actually included in your virtual network. Alright, so both these subnets are actually in your virtual network. So one virtual network will have as many subnets as you want, and each subnet will have different properties because of its network security groups. Moving along, guys, now let's, so enough of talks. I have explained you everything you need to know. Let's go ahead and start with a demo. And for that, let's look at the steps that we're going to do. So first, we'll be creating a network security group. That is the firewall that is required for a server. So basically, we'll be creating 2 firewalls, one for a web server and one for a database server. Right, so let's go ahead and do that. So just give me a second. I'll go to my Azure dashboard. Alright, so guys, this is how my dashboard actually looks like. Now on this dashboard, the first job that I have to do is to create a network security group. So let us do that. Let us go to the search bar and type network security groups. Right, and once you have done that, you will see it is listed over here. We'll click on it, and then we'll click on add. Now when we click on add, we first have to add the firewall for web server, right? So it is your choice. Either you could deploy the web server first or your database. So you'll type in the name of the network security group. That this is for my web server, so I'll type in web server. Then I'll have to assign a resource group. Now, what is a resource group? So basically, like for our use case today, we'll be deploying a lot of resources, right? So it becomes easier for us to manage it if it comes under one group. All right, so we'll be creating that group over here. So say I'll name the group as live-demo. All right, so this becomes my resource group, and all the resources that I'll be launching today I will include them in this particular group so that it becomes easier to manage for me. All right, and I'll pin it to dashboard and I'll click on create. Now, while it is being created, you would have noticed that I have pinned it to dashboard. Now, what is the dashboard, guys? So for those of you who are not acquainted with the Azure dashboard, so dashboard is just like a desktop, guys, that you have on your computer. So all the shortcuts are created here. Because I would be configuring all the properties, so I want it to be listed here, and that's why I have created a shortcut on the dashboard. All right, so while it is being deployed, let's deploy our second network security group as well, which is for my database. Right, so I'll click on add and I'll type in database. I'll include it in the resource group that I've already created, which is live demo. I'll click on this, I'll pin it to dashboard and I'll click on create. Right, that is it. It's pretty simple. Just enter the name, the resource group that you want to enter it in, and create it. Right, now one thing that I want you to notice is, guys, I've not configured any property as of now, right? I'll do that later. So as of now, I just created two firewalls with the name web server and database. Now what I'll do is, let me come back to my slide to see what we'll be doing next, right? So step 2 is create the virtual network. So now I'll be creating the virtual network in which I will be deploying my servers. Right, so let's do that. Let's create a virtual network. So I'll click here, I'll go to virtual networks, I'll click on add, and I'll give the virtual network name, say VNet, right? And then comes the address space. Now what is the address space? Address space is basically the number of IP addresses that your network can hold. So as of now, this virtual network can hold 256 computers. All right, or 256 virtual machines. Now, since I'll be creating more than 2 subnets, I want an address space which will be more, because each subnet will take some minimum value, right? So let us give it a more elaborate address space. Let me type in this, right, and edit this part, and this will give you a bigger set of addresses to deal with. So now my virtual network will be capable of having 65,000 addresses, which is kind of cool, right? Next, we have the subnet name. So by default, when you create a virtual network, there will be a default subnet which will be created. All right. So this is the address range for that default subnet. So it should be in the same range that we have specified for our virtual network. So let's give it this address, and as you can see in this particular subnet, that is the default subnet, I'll have around 256 machines. All right, so that is it. Nothing else needs to be configured. I will include it in the resource group that I've already created, that is live demo, and location is basically the place where the servers are being deployed, right? So by default it's West US. We'll keep it at that, right? And we'll create this virtual network. That is it, guys. Nothing else to be configured. For as of now, this virtual network does not have any subnets, right? We want a web server subnet and we want a database subnet that we'll be deploying now once the virtual network is ready. All right, let me come back to my slide and show you this diagram. So this diagram basically talks about a virtual network, 2 subnets. Now what I'll be doing is I'll be launching 2 virtual machines and I'll be attaching these virtual machines with this subnet. All right, and this is basically your network security group. This is where you will be configuring your properties, and this also I'll attach to the subnet. Now this VM will then reflect the properties of this particular firewall, right? I'll not be attaching this firewall directly to this VM, but I'll be attaching it to the subnet. Now what advantage do I have in this is that say I launch 3 servers in this subnet, all of them will reflect this property, right? So I don't have to configure them separately. All of them will be reflecting the security group's properties of this particular subnet. All right, I think our virtual network is ready. Let's see. So if I go to my virtual networks, I'll see that I have my virtual network ready. All right, now I'll go inside my virtual network and now I'll be deploying the subnets. So we'll go to the subnets pane, we'll click on add, and let's add our first subnet, which is the web server subnet, right? Now this web server subnet will be attached to a network security group, which will be for the web server, right? So we'll attach the network security group for the web server and we'll click on OK. That is it. It's that simple. Just add the subnet, attach the network security group to that, and you're done, right? Similarly, I'll be deploying the database subnet now, and I'll go to network security groups. I will click on the database subnet, database network security group. I'll click on OK, and bam, I have one more subnet. Let me go back to my dashboard and see what all do I have. So I have the two network security groups. I have deployed the virtual network, I have deployed the subnets in it, and I have attached the firewall to the subnet. All that is left is now the VM. So step 3 is create the web server virtual machine and the database virtual machine. So let us do that. We will go to our pane, go to virtual machines, right? Click on add. And with this, you will get this page wherein you have all the operating systems that you can set in your virtual machine. Now you can set a Ubuntu operating system. You can also configure a Windows server, but we'll be dealing with Ubuntu today, right? So I'll select Ubuntu. I'll click on create, and then I'll get this page where I have to enter the general properties. So I'll name the server as web server, right? I'll give the username that will authenticate me to this particular server. Now, when you talk about the password or the way you will authenticate yourself, you basically have two options. You can either authenticate through a public private key, or you can authenticate through a password. So password is more easier, and since we want our things to be done quicker, I'll give a password, and this is the password. I'll configure it now, and that is it, guys. Nothing else needs to be configured. Resource group, I'll give the resource group that I've already created, that is live demo, and I'll click on OK. On the next page, it will ask me the configuration of my server that I want, right? So do I want a 1 core CPU and a 3.5 GB RAM, or I want a 2 core CPU and 7 GB RAM? I can choose all the configuration which are available here in the view all page, but I'll stick to the first configuration, which is the basic one, so that because I'm doing a demo, right? So I don't need a big machine for it. I'll click on select. Next comes the optional features that I have to configure, right? So the storage, and then what virtual network do I want my server to be deployed in. So we have created the virtual network called VNet. So we'll be deploying it in this. Then comes the subnet. So inside this virtual network, there are 3 subnets. Like I said, one is default, that is created by default. And then we have the database and the web server subnet. So since this is a web server VM, we will be deploying it under the web server subnet. Then comes the public IP address. So it will assign it a public IP address through which we can access it. That is going to be new. And then comes the network security group. So since we have already assigned a network security group in the subnet, we don't need any network security group to be attached over here. So we'll click on none. And then monitoring, do you want it or not? I would prefer to be disabled because I won't be needing the server after this session. So I'll click on disabled and I'll click on OK. All right, so now what will happen is it will validate all the properties that I've entered. And once it has entered, it will give me a page wherein I have to agree to the terms and conditions. And that is it. So I'll agree to the terms and conditions and I'll click on purchase. And that will deploy my server. That is it, guys. So this is my web server being deployed. Let's quickly deploy our database server as well, following the same steps that we have followed now. Right, so I'll choose the Ubuntu machine. I will click on create. I will go to this page and type in the name of the server, which is database, right? The username, so it's Edureka. Authentication type is password, so I'll type in the password now. Confirm the password. And then comes the resource group, so it's live demo, right? And the location is West US. I'll click on OK. Select the most basic configuration, which is the first one. Click on select. Now I'll be configuring the virtual network settings. So subnet would be database, right? Network security group will be none. And that is it. Monitoring will be disabled. Click on OK. It will validate all the properties, and then I shall purchase the server, and which will be deployed. Right? If you are thinking how much is it going to cost me, so each server is going to cost me around 3.5 rupees per hour. Right? So that's like a fraction of a dollar. So I think if you're learning Azure, that is worth it, right? So my servers are being deployed, guys. Now, while my servers are being deployed, let me configure the properties of each server, right? So let me go to the web server firewall and configure the properties. So basically what I'm looking at is the inbound security rules. So I'll click on inbound security rules. So inbound security rules are basically the rules which are created for the connections which are incoming to the server, right? So this is a web server, right? So for a web server, first you have to enable the HTTP connection. So I want the HTTP's connection through HTTP protocol to be enabled over here, right? And the source is any, what kind of people can access the server. So I want the whole world to access my internet website. So the source is any, the service is HTTP, right? And everything else is default. The action, what do you want? Do you want to deny it or you want to allow it? So I want to allow the connections. So I'll select allow and I'll click on OK. Alright, so my security rule is being created. So while this is being created, guys, we'll have to add one more security rule, which is the HTTPS security rule, because our websites connect through two protocols, which is HTTP and HTTPS. So we'll configure HTTPS as well. So let us select HTTPS from the list. Here it is. And then the action is allow. And you might be wondering what this priority number is, right? So priority number is basically the number which will be given to your rule. So say example, in my previous rule, I gave the priority number as 100, right? So when it reads the set of rules that are given in the firewall, the first rule would be the least number which is there. So the least number is 100 and it goes up to, I think, 900, right? So it will read all the rules according to the numbers and then configure them. So we have added the HTTP rule, and the HTTPS rule is also being added, and that is it. That is all which is required. So let me just refresh it, and I can see that HTTP and HTTPS rules are already been given. Now I also want to SSH. I should be able to SSH into my server, but before that, let me show you what if I don't configure the property here. Let's see what that then happens, right? So for configuring my web server, I'll have to SSH into the web server to see to install all the softwares which are required for that particular server, right? So let's connect to this server. So the way I can connect is using a software called Putty. So I launch this software, I'll paste the IP address here, and as of now, guys, I have not added the SSH property, right? So if I try to connect, it will show the screen and it will keep on pointing here, right? So the connection will time out after a few, say 30 or 40 seconds, and that basically means that the server is refusing any connection to it. And the reason for that is that I have not configured it in my firewall. So to do that, see, as you can see, it has given me an error which says connection timed out. So to do that, I'll have to go to my firewall, which is the network security groups of my web server. Right, I'll go to the inbound security rules, and now I'll add a rule for SSH. So once I add the rule, I'll be able to connect to my service. So it's done, my security rule is being created, and once it is created, I'll be able to SSH into the server. Also, it takes some time for that rule to actually be applied, right? It says that it created a security rule, but sometimes it takes time to reflect. Let's see if the rule is being reflected here. And yes, the rule is being reflected. So as you can see, I've added the SSH rule, and now it is giving me the login page. So I log in into my server, which with the username Edureka, I configured the username to be Edureka, and now it will ask me the password after authenticating the username. So I'll type in the password, and if everything goes well, I'll be authenticated to my server, right? Yes, so I am in my server. So this is my Ubuntu server, which is running on Azure Cloud. Now I need to configure the softwares in it so that it becomes a web server. Alright, so as of now, there's nothing installed on it. It's a fresh piece of software. So let me first update this Ubuntu. So I'll type in the update command. It's sudo apt get update. Right, now it will take some time to update. Meanwhile, guys, let me quickly show you if I can access my web server as of now or not. Right, so I'll go to virtual machines, I'll go to web server. Now you might ask me that we have already configured it to accept HTTP connection, but still if I try to connect to this server, I'll not be able to do so. It will return me a empty response screen. So this basically means that there is nothing configured on my server as of now. So what I'll do is, so my Ubuntu is now updated. So what I'll do is now is I'll update it with the Apache software, right? So I'll type in the command for Apache. So sudo apt get install apache 2. All right. Once I've done that, it will install the Apache software here. And within seconds you can see that I'll be able to connect to this server. So it's starting the service processing. Yeah, so Apache is installed. Now if I try to connect to this server, you'll be able to see that I'm getting the Apache screen. So if you want, you can connect to this server. The IP address is 40.83.140.100. My team will be handing you out this IP address. So I'll repeat it again. It's 40.83.140.100. You can go to this link and you'll see the Apache page as of now. Now, as we'll go along and we'll update this website, you'll see that this page will be updated. Alright, so I have the Apache working on my server now. Now, my website that I have created, it is actually a PHP website, so I'll have to install PHP on this server as well. So I'll write sudo apt get php 5 and I'll have to install it. So this is it. 1 second. So I misspelled install, my bad, sorry. Right. So now my PHP will be installed on this system, and while this is being installed, guys, let me show you how my website actually looks like. So I'll go to localhost and I'll type in the address for my website. Alright, so this is how my website actually looks like. It's pretty simple. You just have to enter your name, your email, your mobile number, your location, and once you click on submit, all of this address will go to MySQL. Now MySQL is in a different server, this will be in a different server, and what we're trying to do is we're trying to authenticate them to each other using virtual networks. Alright, so if I go to my web server, so my PHP has been installed, and with PHP I also need an extension which will allow it to connect to MySQL. So for that I'll have to install that extension as well. So sudo apt get install php 5 hyphen mysql. Right, so with this my extension will get installed on the system, and that is it. Alright, so my web server is configured now. Let's go on and configure our MySQL now. Alright, so MySQL is a bit tricky, guys, because there is a lot of configuration that you have to do, but let's hope for the best and see if we can connect to it. Alright, also guys, if you would have noticed, I've not configured anything for my server, for my database server. So as we did in web server, I'll show you. If you try to connect to it, as of now we'll not be able to. So while this is being loaded, let me quickly go to the properties of my database server, right, and include the inbound security rules according to what I want. So I'll first have to enable the SSH rule, right? So this is how I'll be able to connect to my server. So I'll select the SSH service. The action is allow. I'll click on OK, and my security rule will now be created. Also, I should also be able to create a MySQL connection to this server, because I want this server to be accessed through my computer, right? If I for example, I'll be creating a database, I'll be adding the table, right? So I want to do all of that through my computer. I don't want to SSH into the Ubuntu again to configure anything. So we'll be doing that. So we need a MySQL connection as well. So let's add that. So it would be MySQL, and the service would be MySQL. Action is allow. I'll click on OK. And this is it, guys. So now the security rule will be created, and if we try now to connect to our database server, I'll be able to do so. So I'll copy the IP address, I'll click on open, I'll say yes, and now it'll ask me for the login name. So as you can see, the security rule worked. It is asking me for the login name and now the password. So I'll give the password for this. And done. With this, I'll be authenticated to my Ubuntu server. First of all, I'll update this machine with the update command, like we did in the previous server as well, right? So now it will be updated. After this, I'll install the MySQL service that we'll be using to connect our website from, right? So I'll now install the MySQL service, which is sudo apt-get install MySQL server. Right, this is it. I'll type in Y, which means yes, and now it'll ask me for the password. I'll type in the password and confirm it again. Hit enter, and that's it. Okay, so now I've configured MySQL, I've installed MySQL on my system. The next thing is, by default, MySQL only allows the local host to access the root user. Right? If I want to connect through my machine, I have to create one more user for MySQL for me to access it. Right? So once my MySQL is installed, I'll show you what I mean. Right? So we'll be doing that. And I think we are done. Yeah, so we're done. So let's connect to our MySQL service now. So the user is root and the password was Edureka123 to connect to my database, and we are in. So like I was saying, we have to create a user that we'll be accessing from. So let's create a user for MySQL. So I type in create user, say the username is Edureka for my database. Where is it? It is on localhost, and I should add the password for it. Let me add the password as Edureka123, right? And let me deploy this server. So I've created the username. Now I'll have to grant all the privileges to this particular server. So let me give the command for that. So it's grant all privileges on everything that is there on this database to this particular username which resides on localhost. So this is a command that we'll be configuring. Alright, now same set we'll be configuring for the percentage host. So let us do that as well. Alright, and then grant all the privileges for the same. Alright, so done. So we have created successfully a new user. Now if I try to connect to this database using this user, let's see how we can do that. So I'll type in MySQL. So previously I authenticated myself using root, but now I'll use the Edureka username and see if I can connect to it. Sorry, I misspelled it. So it's Edureka-P, and now the password. So as you can see, I can authenticate through. Alright, sorry for that glitch. All right, so now what we'll be doing is like I was saying, so we have to configure one more file for our MySQL to get configured, right? So for that, let us go to our directory, that is etc, and in that MySQL, right? Now in this particular directory, I have a file called my.cnf. So this is the configuration file that I'll have to configure for connecting to my MySQL. So I'll sudo nano into it, and then I will get to this particular statement which says bind address. So this bind address statement basically says that only localhost connections are allowed to my MySQL, right? So I'll have to comment this part out, and then I'll save it, and that is it, guys. So this was the last setting that I had to do. Now if I try connecting it through my computer, I'll be able to connect to this particular MySQL instance. So how to do that? First I have to go to my MySQL installation folder, which is somewhere here, right? So let me quickly go to my folder. So this is the folder where my MySQL resides. So now I'll connect it using this particular command which says mysql-h. Now I'll paste in the IP address, the username which is Edureka, the port number which is 3306, and then the password. It'll ask me for the password, so the password is Edureka123. Now mind you guys, it will not connect right now. It will give me an error that it can't connect to MySQL service, and the reason for that is that we have configured everything after the MySQL service started on my server. So now I'll have to restart my server to connect to it, right? So it'll take some time, and then it'll throw an error that it can't connect to the particular MySQL server, right? So as you can see, so for now connecting to it, we will have to restart the service. So let me restart it by typing in sudo service mysql restart. Alright, so with this command, my MySQL will get restarted. So let's see. So my MySQL has stopped and now it has restarted. And now if I try to connect to my MySQL server, yes. So I have it on my computer now. I am able to connect to my MySQL server. Let's quickly create a database for my website which says create database entry. So I'll quickly create a database, and I'll create a table for this, right? Which is create table entries. I'll give the name, and then the second entry is email address, so that is varchar30, right? And then the location, which is again varchar30, and then my mobile number, which I'll be feeding here. All right, so I think the net is giving some problems. All right, so I didn't select the database, so use entry, and then I'll create the table. So guys, there is some problem with our internet connection. I think it is residing on your end as well. So what we'll do is we'll continue this session in our next video. So we have created the database. Now next is creating a web server that we'll do in our next session. All right. So let me quickly come back to my slide, which is here, right? So we have created a VM for the web server. We have created a VM for database. We have configured a database. We can connect to a database to our computer. All that is left is configuring the web server. So we'll do that in the next section, and I'll show you how you can configure the properties for it. And yeah. So guys, thank you for attending today's session. I hope you learned something new today. Now whatever we have done today, I want you to try it on your end as well, and then we'll move on and I'll show you how you can configure your web server as well. Now before ending guys, let me quickly show you our landing page for Edureka. So this is how my landing page looks like. So we have two batches that are starting on 12th of August or 9th of September, and the timing, you have a night batch and you have a morning batch as well. So for those of you, we know that you as professionals, you don't have time, right? So you can choose a batch according to your preference and go ahead if you want to enroll in our course. Also, if you want to look at the course description, the section is here. Again, now our tutorials, we also have blogs for our Azure section. So you can, if you are a reader and you want to get to know more about Azure, you can read it in our blogs. So as of now, there are 3 blogs. We'll be continuously updating the blogs over here. So you can be subscribed to this particular link to get all the updates. Also, we have a YouTube channel in which we post tutorials for our Azure session. So you can go through all the videos if you want to know more about Azure. And for further live sessions guys, you have to subscribe to our channel. So if you're not already subscribed, please subscribe to our channel, and once you subscribe, there'll be a bell icon over here, so you have to click on the bell icon to get the notification for our next live sessions. Alright, so with that guys, thank you for attending today's session. Have a nice day ahead. Goodbye.